The cemetery at Silver Pines had a way of making people feel small, not in a cruel way. In the way that old stone and old earth tend to do, a quiet reminder that time moves in one direction and does not wait for anyone to catch their breath. Evelyn Hart had been coming here every December for 7 years, and every year the place felt both smaller and larger than she remembered. The gates were narrower. The rows of headstones stretched further. She arrived at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning, her car parked at the lot near the entrance because she had learned long ago not to drive all the way to the East Ridge. The path was gravel in summer. In December it was something between mud and ice, and she had ruined 2 pairs of expensive shoes before accepting that some things required you to walk. She walked now, hands deep in the pockets of her charcoal coat, breath visible in the air. The snow had started the night before and had not fully committed to stopping. It came in intervals, pausing long enough to raise your hopes, then returning with quiet insistence. By the time Evelyn reached the East Ridge, the older headstones had an inch of white along their tops. Her father's was newer, darker granite, and it held the snow differently, more cleanly. Thomas Arthur Hart. 1948-2017. Beloved Father. She had approved the inscription herself and later wondered if beloved was accurate, or if it was simply what you wrote when the other options seemed worse. She could not think of a better word. She had not tried very hard. Evelyn stood a few feet back from the stone and looked at it the way she looked at most things, directly, without sentiment. Gathering information. The fresh flowers she had ordered from a florist in Denver had arrived yesterday. She'd had the cemetery staff place them, as she did every year. White chrysanthemums, because they were her father's preference, and she had remembered that without having to look it up. She had not spoken at his funeral. She had stood in the front row and kept her face composed and thought about the quarterly report she needed to review. Grief, she had found, was easiest when redirected. 70-hour work weeks had gotten her through the first year. The second year, she had built a secondary branch of Hart Capital and expanded into 4 new markets. By the third year, she had stopped counting. Now she came once a year, stood here for 20 minutes, and left. It was not sentimental. It was not nothing, either. She was reaching into her coat pocket for the card she had written, a habit she'd started 2 years ago, leaving a small note tucked behind the flowers. Never sure why when she noticed him. At first, she thought he was a groundskeeper. The coat was dark and bulky, the kind worn for function rather than warmth, and he was kneeling in the snow without what appeared to be any concern for his knees. Then she registered the angle of his head, the stillness of his shoulders, the fact that he was not carrying any tools. He was kneeling at her father's grave. Evelyn stopped walking. The man did not notice her. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered but thin in the way that came from skipping meals rather than training, and his hands resting loosely on his thighs were red from the cold. He was not wearing gloves. His shoes were dark, with wet snow soaking through. He was saying something. She could not hear the words. His head was slightly bowed. Not in prayer exactly, more in the way a person bows their head when the weight of something becomes too much to hold upright. Evelyn stood 12 feet away and watched a stranger grieve at her father's grave. She did not move for a long moment. Then she did. "Excuse me." Her voice came out the way it usually did, clear, flat, carrying authority without raising volume. It was the voice she used in boardrooms when someone had said something incorrect. The man startled. He turned, and she saw his face properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd thought, early 40s, maybe. Dark hair with gray at the temples, a 3-day beard that was not fashionable, just unshaved. His eyes were wet. He did not try to hide this. He looked at her the way people look at someone they've been caught doing something entirely ordinary. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't know anyone else was coming. This is my father's grave." He looked at the stone, then back at her. He got to his feet slowly, not with the stiffness of someone old, but with the deliberateness of someone whose body had been tired for a long time. He was taller standing. He looked like he had not slept well. "Thomas Hart," he said. "You're his daughter, Evelyn." She did not answer immediately. "How do you know my name?" "He talked about you." He said it simply, without any particular weight behind it, as though this were a fact as unremarkable as the weather. Evelyn studied him. His coat had a tear along the left shoulder that had been repaired with a different colored thread. His shoes, the dark wet ones, were work boots, the kind issued for janitorial positions. She filed these details the way she filed all details. Efficiently, without judgment. "He talked about me to whom?" "To me." A pause. "We knew each other. You knew my father." She waited. He seemed to understand that the wait was a request, not a gap. He looked at the grave again briefly, as though checking whether it would mind being discussed, and then he looked back at her. "My name is Noah Bennett," he said. "I work at the district school over on Callaway. Janitor. Before that, I was at the community center on 5th. Before that," he stopped. "Before that, I was in a bad place." "What kind of bad place?" He met her eyes. "The kind you don't always come back from." Evelyn said nothing. The snow was falling again. Small flakes, almost weightless. "Your father helped me," Noah said. "About 10 years ago, maybe 11 now. I've been coming here every year since he passed. I looked up when he died. I saw it in the paper. I thought." He let the thought trail off, then tried again. "I didn't think I'd be in the way. How did you help yourself to information about when he was buried? Obituaries are public." "Fair." She looked at him more carefully. The wet eyes, the still reddened hands, the fact that he was here on a Wednesday morning, not a weekend, which meant he had taken time off from a job that almost certainly did not pay well enough for unnecessary absences. "What did he do?" she said finally. "That helped you." Noah Bennett looked at the grave. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then, he sat with me," he said. "That's mostly it," he told her in pieces, standing in the snow. She did not suggest they move somewhere warmer. The cold was neutral, which suited her. It kept things clear. 11 years ago, Noah Bennett had been sleeping in the Salvation Army shelter on Morrison Street when he could get a bed, and in the stairwell of the parking garage on 14th when he could not. He was 31 years old. He had been married briefly and badly, had a daughter he was not allowed to see, and had spent 2 years making a series of decisions that he described with neither drama nor self-pity, simply as a list of left turns that eventually led somewhere dark. He had been outside the church on Whitmore Avenue one evening in December, not for any religious reason, just because the overhang kept off the snow when a man sat down beside him on the steps. Not a priest, not anyone official. A man in a good coat who sat down the way you'd sit on a park bench in summer, with no particular agenda. He didn't introduce himself right away, Noah said. He just sat there. I thought he was waiting for someone. They sat in silence for a while. Then the man asked if Noah had eaten. Not in a pointed way, the way you might ask a neighbor. Noah had not eaten. The man, Thomas Hart, though Noah didn't know his name, then went to the diner on the corner and came back with 2 containers of soup and a sleeve of crackers. He sat back down on the church steps in the December cold and ate his own soup, and Noah ate his. And for a while, neither of them said anything in particular. He asked me what I was good at, Noah said. Not what had gone wrong, not what I needed. Just, what am I good at? What did you say? I told him I was good at fixing things, engines, mostly. I used to work in my uncle's garage. A brief pause. He said that was useful. What Thomas Hart had done next was not dramatic. He did not write a check or make a phone call to a shelter director or deliver a speech about potential. He gave Noah a business card for a property management company run by someone he knew and told him to mention his name. He said there was a maintenance position. He said if Noah showed up clean and on time, the rest was Noah's problem to solve. And that was it? Evelyn said. He came back a few times that winter. Checked in. Noah shifted his weight. I didn't make it easy. I didn't take the job immediately. I took it eventually. Kept it 8 months, then got a better one. Started paying child support. He stopped. It was a long road. I'm not saying he waved a wand, but you're saying he started it. I'm saying he saw me when I wasn't easy to see. He looked at her directly. That matters more than people think. Evelyn was quiet. She had been to charity dinners. She had written substantial checks to organizations whose letterheads she trusted. She had sat on 2 nonprofit boards and helped restructure their giving models for maximum efficiency. She thought of her philanthropy the way she thought of most things as a problem to be optimized. She thought about her father writing a check. She could not picture it, but she could almost unwillingly picture him sitting on church steps in a good coat, eating diner soup in the cold, asking a stranger what he was good at. She could picture that precisely. "He never mentioned you," she said finally. "No," Noah said. "I don't imagine he would." She drove back to Denver that afternoon with the heating too high and her mind working. Evelyn Hart's default response to things she did not understand was to gather more information until she did. Emotion, she had found, was not a reliable guide to anything, but evidence generally was. She spent 2 hours on Wednesday evening going through her father's personal files, which she had digitized after his death and filed in a cloud server she had not opened in 4 years. The business accounts she knew well. She had inherited the firm and spent the first year of her tenure understanding every transaction her father had ever made. The business accounts were clean, detailed, unremarkable. It was the personal account that gave her pause, not because anything was hidden. Thomas Hart had not been the kind of man who hid things. He simply hadn't expected anyone to look closely at what he considered private. The personal account showed his regular expenses, the mortgage until it was paid off, utilities, his car, his subscription to the newspaper he still had delivered in print, and then, scattered throughout, a series of small transfers to an account she didn't recognize. $50. $75. $100. Never large, always irregular. She cross-referenced the account number. It took her 20 minutes and a favor called in from someone at her bank, which she was not strictly entitled to, but Evelyn had always found that confidence was its own kind of authorization. The receiving account belonged to a nonprofit called Whitmore Community Fund. She looked it up. It was small, genuinely small, not the kind of small that wealthy people called boutique. It ran job training programs out of a church hall on Whitmore Avenue, the church on Whitmore Avenue, the one with the overhang. The fund had existed for 12 years. Her father's contributions began in year 2. He had never been listed as a donor. He was not on the board. His name appeared nowhere on their website, which was functional rather than polished, the kind of site maintained by volunteers who were better at the work than the marketing. She transferred the file to her private drive and kept going. The transfers to Whitmore were not the only ones. There were others to a name she didn't recognize, a woman called Margaret Calloway, receiving $100 a month for 3 years, beginning in 2009, to a small restaurant supply store in Commerce City, to a hardware store that had since closed. None of it added up to anything like a pattern Evelyn recognized, which meant the pattern was something she had never thought to look for. She closed the laptop at midnight and sat in her kitchen with a glass of water and looked out at the city lights and the snow. She had known her father for 37 years. She had understood him, she thought, fairly well. A reserved man. Precise, not warm in the conventional sense. Not the kind of father who coached Little League or remembered birthdays without being reminded. He had cared about her, she was certain of that, but he had demonstrated it in ways she often missed, showing up at her school debates without being asked, quietly arranging her first internship through a contact he never mentioned, leaving money in her account when she was in college without noting what it was for. He had loved her in a language she'd spent years learning to read. She wondered now what other languages he had been speaking, and to whom. She found Margaret Calloway on a Thursday afternoon in January. The woman was 58 years old, worked part-time at a grocery distribution center, and lived in a two-bedroom house in Lakewood with her daughter's family. Evelyn called ahead, identified herself, and drove out on a cloudy afternoon with a box of pastries from a bakery she liked because efficiency and courtesy were not mutually exclusive. Margaret Calloway met her at the door with the particular expression of someone who has been expecting an uncomfortable conversation and has decided to get through it with grace. She was a small woman, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had once been very pretty and was now simply honest. She made coffee. They sat in a kitchen that smelled like dish soap and last night's dinner, and Evelyn asked her question. "How did you know my father?" Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. "I was in a very dark place," she said. 2009. My husband had left. I had 3 kids, the youngest was 2. I had just been told my hours were being cut at the job I had. She glanced at Evelyn. I was standing outside the bank on Grant Street. I had just tried to get a loan. They said no. I was standing outside and I was trying to work out if I had options. And your father came out of the bank behind me. Was he a customer? I assume so. He looked like a man who had a reason to be in a bank. She said it without bitterness. He asked me if I was all right. I said I was fine. He said I didn't look fine. A small pause. I told him everything. I don't know why. I was so tired that I had run out of the energy to pretend. Thomas Hart had listened. He had not told her what to do. He had asked a few questions, practical ones, about the specifics of her situation, and then he had told her about a family services program downtown that had a waiting list but was worth getting on, and a contact at a different bank who was more sympathetic to unusual situations, and a night care co-op in her neighborhood that she had not heard of. He had followed up. Not immediately, 3 weeks later, a letter with a note that simply said, "I hope things are moving." Enclosed was a check for $500. I tried to find him to return it, Margaret said. I did return it eventually, when things were better. He wouldn't take it. He said, give it to someone who needed it. Evelyn set down her coffee cup. He told me, Margaret said carefully, that most people in trouble don't need to be rescued. They need one door to open. Just one. And sometimes a door needs someone to hold it. Outside the window, the January sky was flat and gray, the color of old snow about to turn. Evelyn thought about all the doors she had passed through in her life, the internship, the referral to her first investor, the quiet word her father had put in with her first board. Doors she had assumed opened because she had pushed hard enough. She sat in Margaret Calloway's kitchen for another 40 minutes. When she left, she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. The snow began again, light and slow. She went back to Silver Pines in February. There was no particular occasion. She told herself she had questions she wanted to think through, and that the cemetery was quiet. Both of these things were true. The snow was deeper now than in December, and the East Ridge path had been cleared only down the center, leaving white walls on either side. Her father's headstone was half buried. The flowers she'd left in December were gone, and the flower holders were empty and frosted over. She stood in front of the stone for a longer time than usual. She had been, she thought, a very specific kind of daughter, the kind who excelled at everything that could be measured and was frequently at a loss with everything that could not. She had gotten excellent grades. She had built a successful firm. She had handled his estate with precision and without visible distress, and had made every arrangement exactly as he would have wanted. She had been competent and somewhat absent, and she had assumed those two things canceled each other out. She was no longer sure they did. "You didn't tell me," she said aloud. Her voice came out strange in the cold, flatter than she intended. She was not in the habit of talking to gravestones. She felt faintly ridiculous. She kept going anyway. "You helped people. You did it for years, quietly. You never told me." She stopped. "Was that were you keeping it from me specifically? Or did you just not think I'd understand?" The stone said nothing. Snow shifted somewhere in a tree branch above her. She thought about the last time she had spoken to her father. A phone call in October, a week before his first stroke. She had told him about a deal she was closing. He had listened carefully and asked good questions. At the end of the call, he had said, "You're doing well, Evelyn." She had thanked him and hung up, and had thought about the deal for the rest of the evening and not given the conversation any particular weight. "You're doing well." She had assumed he meant professionally. She crouched down without deciding to. Her coat hem touched the snow. She was wearing gloves, good ones, and she pressed one palm flat against the face of the stone and felt the cold come through the leather. How many of them were there? She said quietly. How many people? She already knew there were more than Noah, more than Margaret. The Whitmore contributions alone spanned a decade. He had been doing this quietly, consistently, for years, threading small acts through his life the way you'd thread silver through cloth, invisible from the front. She had been right next to him for 37 years. She had not seen it. She stayed crouched in the snow until her legs ached, and then she sat down fully on the cold ground in her good coat and let the cold be what it was. The part that hurt most was not that she had missed it. The part that hurt most was wondering what she had been so busy looking at that she had missed it. In March, she began reading his journals. She had known they existed. He kept 3-ring binders, not notebooks, binders, with labeled tabs, which she had boxed and stored in her spare room because she hadn't been ready to go through them and then had simply not gotten around to it. She retrieved 2 boxes, set them on the dining table, and started from the beginning. The journals were not emotional documents. That would have been unlike him. They were more like logs, observations about what he was reading, notes on conversations, records of what he was working on. The style was spare and precise and familiar to her in an uncomfortable way, because her own writing style was similar. She found the first mention of Whitmore Avenue in a binder from 2003. Met a young man outside the church tonight. Some people are unlucky and some people are lost. He seemed like the second kind. We'll look into whether there's a program worth contributing to. That was all. 2 pages later, called Gerald at Whitmore Fund. They do good work. Writing a check, no fanfare. No reflection on what it meant or how it made him feel. Just a decision noted and moved on from. She found other names, different stories, similarly recorded. Each one given a few lines, occasionally followed up on, and then nothing. No column marked impact. No sense that he was tracking outcomes or measuring returns. He had just kept doing it. She thought about her own approach. The charity dinners, she attended the tables she bought, the donations she made at amounts calibrated to the right tax bracket and the right level of visibility. She did not do it cynically. Exactly. She did it because visible philanthropy created relationships that benefited the firm, and because the money went to real causes. Both of these things were true, but she had never, she realized, sat on church steps in the cold and asked a struggling person what they were good at. She had written checks. She had not looked at faces. She thought about the difference for a long time. It was not comfortable thinking. She did not try to resolve it quickly. Evelyn Hart had spent her adult life optimizing, and the one thing she had learned from enough cycles of optimization was that some problems did not get solved. They got lived with differently. Slowly, through behavior rather than thought. She closed the journal. She picked up her phone and called Noah Bennett. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding slightly out of breath, as if he had been moving something heavy. She identified herself. A pause. "Miss Hart, Evelyn, I wanted to ask about your son." She had found the reference in a conversation she had with a Whitmore staff member she called on the pretense of making a donation, which she then also made. "How old is he?" "Caleb." "He's 9. A wariness in the voice, not hostile, just careful. "What school does he go to?" "Jefferson Elementary." "I work there, actually." "I know." She looked at the notes she had made. "There's a tuition program through the district. A gifted and enrichment track. Caleb's teacher nominated him last year. I understand the application wasn't completed. A longer pause. No, Noah said quietly. It wasn't. She didn't ask why. She knew why. Application fees, time off work to complete the process. The particular exhaustion of navigating bureaucratic forms when you were also maintaining an elementary school during the day and raising a child alone at night. If you're willing, she said, I can have someone walk you through the application process. There are fee waivers. There's also a before-school care component that I understand wasn't previously available, but there's been a new slot opened. You arranged that? The slot already existed. Someone just hadn't communicated it to families properly. This was true. It had taken her one phone call and an email, both of which she had made without identifying her interest in the specific outcome. Noah was quiet for a moment. You're going to help Caleb, he said. I think Caleb is going to do that himself. I'm offering to remove some obstacles. She heard him exhale slowly. I don't need charity, he said. Not defensively. Just with the quiet clarity of a man who had thought about this sentence and chosen to say it. I know, she said. This isn't that. She was not sure she could have explained the difference clearly. She knew it was real. I'll think about it, he said. Take your time. She hung up and sat with the phone on the table in front of her. Outside, the March light was still thin, the kind of pale gray that made you unsure whether spring was coming or whether winter had simply lost interest. She opened her laptop and began drafting a memo to her foundation's operations director. There were 7 existing programs she wanted to review. Not restructure, not rebrand review. She wanted to know what the people inside those programs needed that they weren't getting. She wanted to ask the question her father had asked, in a form appropriate to the scale she operated at. What are you good at? What do you need to use it? She worked until past midnight. She did not announce any of it. By April, Noah had completed Caleb's application. Evelyn knew this because the school district's enrichment coordinator, who had been grateful for the slot clarification, mentioned it in passing during a call about a different matter. She did not follow up. She wrote the name Caleb Bennett in a notebook and moved on. She had been thinking about legacy, not in the way the word usually gets used, not about her name on a building, or her firm's reputation, or how she would be remembered by people who had never met her. She had been thinking about it the way you think about it when you have recently sat in a February cemetery and understood for the first time that someone you thought you knew was significantly larger than you had perceived. She established a small fund that spring. It was not called the Thomas Hart Fund, because he would have found that embarrassing. She named it the Silver Pines Community Initiative, after the cemetery, which she thought was probably eccentric enough that he might have found it amusing. The fund's model was simple. It worked in partnership with 3 existing organizations. Whitmore was one of them and provided what it called bridge support, small amounts of money and practical assistance for people in transition. Not long-term subsidies, not rescue programs, bridges. She hired a director, a woman named Frances Doyle, who had spent 15 years working in housing assistance and had strong opinions about what actually worked and gave her a clear, brief, and genuine autonomy. Evelyn served as chair. She attended the quarterly meetings and read every report. She stayed out of the operations. The first time she visited a Whitmore program session, she sat in the back and watched a room full of people who were in various stages of figuring out what came next. Nobody introduced her. She had asked Frances not to. She watched a man about Noah's age working through a resume with a volunteer. The man kept stopping and looking at the paper and then looking away, as though the words on it were failing to represent him accurately, which they probably were. After the session, she talked to the volunteer for a while about what the participants most commonly needed. The volunteer, a retired high school teacher named Patrick Gaines, said the same thing in slightly different ways several times. And it always came down to the same point. They needed someone to take them seriously before they had given anyone a reason to. She wrote that down. She thought about a man on church steps in December, being asked what he was good at. She thought, "You could have told me. And then she thought, maybe you did, and I just wasn't listening. On the drive home, she passed through Silver Pines, not to stop. Just through the road that skirted the east edge of the cemetery. The spring had softened the ground, and the trees were just beginning to show the first tentative green. She looked at it through the car window as she drove past. She did not stop. She kept going, thinking about work. December again. The same cemetery. The same East Ridge path, cleared now down the center. The same white walls on either side. Evelyn arrived at 10:30 and parked in the lot and walked the familiar route. Her breath visible, the air sharp and clean in a way that she had come to associate with this day. She carried the flowers herself this time. White chrysanthemums. She had picked them up on the way. She came around the last row of older stones and stopped. Noah Bennett was there. He was standing, this time, not kneeling, standing with his hands in the pockets of a coat that was newer than last year's, though still not expensive. Beside him was a boy of about 9, slight and dark-haired, wearing a hat that was slightly too big for him and a scarf tied by someone who had tried but was not an expert at scarves. They turned when they heard her footsteps in the snow. Noah looked at her without surprise. She thought he had probably known she came on this date. "Evelyn," he said. "Noah." She looked at the boy. "This is Caleb." "Hi," Caleb said. He had the directness of a child who has been raised to be honest. "Hello." She crouched down in front of the boy, which she did not usually do for anyone, and looked at him at eye level. He looked back steadily. "Did you know Mr. Hart?" he asked. "He was my father. My dad says he was a good person." "Your dad is right." Caleb considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old weighing evidence. Then he turned and looked at the headstone. And in that gesture Evelyn recognized something she had once seen in herself, the look of a child trying to understand something too large to fully comprehend. She stood up. She knelt in front of the grave the first time she had knelt here. Not sat, not crouched, but knelt deliberately and placed the chrysanthemums in the holder. She straightened the ones already there. Noah and Caleb had brought something too. She wasn't sure what they were, winter wildflowers, maybe, the kind that came in mixed bunches from the grocery store. She straightened them alongside the chrysanthemums without comment. The three of them stood there for a while. Snow came and went. A gust moved through the tree line at the edge of the cemetery, stirring the branches. "He came to my dad when my dad needed help," Caleb said. He was addressing the headstone, Evelyn realized. Not her or Noah. He had apparently decided to speak to Thomas Hart directly, the way children sometimes do things without recognizing the audacity of them. "That's a good thing to do. My dad taught me that." Noah said nothing. His jaw was set. Evelyn looked at her father's name on the stone. Thomas Arthur Hart. 1948 2017. She had written the inscription. She had chosen beloved. She remembered standing in the funeral director's office, mildly impatient, wanting to get it done. She had written it as a formality. She knew now it was not a formality. She also knew it was still not complete. There was no stone wide enough for what she was only now beginning to understand about this man. That he had moved through the world doing small, consistent, unannounced things because he believed that was how it worked, quietly, personally, without requiring recognition. He had not taught her this explicitly. He had just done it for 30 years and trusted that the example was available if she ever looked. She had not looked. She was looking now. She stood up. The snow was falling in earnest now, the kind that settles rather than drifts. Everything softened at the edges. He used to say, Noah said, quietly and without being asked, that most people think about the help they give as an event, like it's a single thing that happens. But he thought of it more like, he paused, searching, like a direction. You keep facing the same way. And eventually the walking is just what you do. Evelyn turned this over. He said that to you? More or less. He said something like it. Noah half smiled, brief and genuine. He wasn't a talker. No, she said. He wasn't. Caleb had found a stick and was drawing a shape in the snow at the edge of the path. Children at grave sites eventually find the periphery, the practical wisdom of the very young. Evelyn looked at her father's name one more time. She had come here every year for 7 years, believing she was fulfilling an obligation. A ritual. Something owed to the memory of a relationship that had been real but never fully translated. She understood now that the ritual had been waiting for her to understand what it was for. Not obligation, not accounting. More like she searched for the word attendance, the ongoing act of showing up in the same direction as someone you were trying to learn. She said nothing aloud. She had already said what she needed to say, in the months of quiet work and the small fund now running and the questions she had started asking of people who were tired of not being asked. Same time next year? Noah said. It was an offering, not an assumption. She considered him, this man she had first seen, as a stranger, then as a claim to be verified, then as a single piece of evidence, and now, gradually, as someone who carried a part of her father that she had not known to look for. Yes, she said. The snow settled. Caleb looked up from his drawing a house, she saw, with smoke rising from a chimney in the careful, deliberate style of children who are serious about getting it right. They stood together in the white quiet, the three of them, and the snow came down clean and even on everything. Evelyn did not speak again. She stood facing the grave of a man she was still learning, and she felt not happiness exactly, and not grief exactly, but something that sat between them, the particular ache of understanding arriving too late and being welcome anyway. She thought, "You didn't leave," she thought. "You just kept going, and you left a direction." She thought, "I'm trying to face the same way." The snow kept falling. She let it.